The development of a video game is often a journey wrought with difficulties. From issues such as creative problems, budgetary constraints, having Peter Molyneux on the team, to just generally languishing in development hell. But one of the most overlooked possibilities is, occasionally, very rarely, a sequel to a big IP will go through production, but all of a sudden evolve into a completely different game. And some of these could be for the most bizarre, stupid, or just downright hilarious reasons possible. So this episode is dedicated to those forgotten follow-ups, those slain sequels, and those cancelled consecutions. Hi, I'm Guru Larry, and I welcome you to 5 games you never knew had sequels. Well, it should be 5 games you never knew had sequels because they were released as totally unrelated games, but that sounds idiotic and doesn't fit in the title description bar. So, humour me on this one. Speak to a lot of gamers, and they'll say that the Streets of Rage trilogy was one, if not the greatest scrolling beat-em-ups ever made. Well, the non-Final Fight fanboys will anyway. But the epic story of 3 20-something ex-police officers going vigilante to take on the world's most incompetent street gang, I mean, the entire cartel only has one gun between a whole lot of them, was just too compelling to kids of the 1990s. The first Streets of Rage was excellent, the second was an all-time classic, and the third is alright. Even with its soccer mum censorship in the West and the soundtrack sounded like somebody having an epileptic fit on a stylophone. Sadly, despite its popularity, the Streets of Rage series was one of the many franchise victims that Sega decided to dump at the end of the 16-bit life cycle, and would never be officially seen on a Sega console ever again. Now, there have been a few attempts to resurrect the series, from Backbone Entertainment's pitch, Green's short-lived remake, Crackdown developer Ruffian Games' Xbox 360 reiteration of the original, to even Sega themselves having a stab at a sequel for the Dreamcast to no avail. But the first notable pitch for a genuine sequel to Streets of Rage was by Core Design, best known for creating the Tomb Raider series, and despite being rejected, was actually released. You'll probably know it today as Fighting Force. Now, Fighting Force is an interesting kettle of fish. You can instantly tell who the protagonists were originally meant to be. Hawk Manson was obviously Axel, Ben Smasher Jackson is Max, Mace Daniels is Blaze, and Alana is, Skate? Well, and you got me there. In all honesty, that's really where the Streets of Rage similarities end. Making the game fully 3D and having such large areas to fight in made the game feel completely different. It also suffers from the usual which direction I'm supposed to be punching issue that plagued the majority of early 3D beat-em-ups at the time. But in general, it does make you think, did they really try to get the license to piggyback off the name, or they just weren't that knowledgeable of the actual IP in the first place? It's an okay game, nothing brilliant, receiving average scores in magazines at the time. But it was popular enough to warrant a sequel, which was more a first/third person shooter than a beat-em-up this time around, indicating they knew where the industry was going, even back then. There is even a third game in development for the original Xbox and PS2 before being cancelled early on, due to Core being closed down because of the infamous Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness debacle. So, what was the reason for this not becoming a Streets of Rage game? Well, remarkably, Sega were originally all for it being the 4th game, but there seems to have been some crossed wires in communication. Core Games wanted the license, but to recuperate costs, they would release it on all platforms, not just as a Saturn exclusive. Sega suddenly realised they were going to release one of their biggest franchises onto a rival's consoles, so pulled the plug. So Core then did a bit of tinkering and released the game as Fighting Force, or the hilariously named Metal Fist if you happen to live in Japan. A Nintendo 64 port was released a year later, but the Saturn version, while completed, was ultimately cancelled. Sega even wanted to publish it themselves at some point as Judgment Force. But was it cancelled to spite Sega, or just they didn't expect enough sales? We may never know. Or particularly care as the game's a bit crap. The Cold War of the 80s was a terrifying thing at the time. But it did inspire some great video games, and none more famous than a classic arcade game, Green Beret, or Russian Attack if you happen to live in the US. Well, whatever you called it in your neck of the woods, the game was about the adventures of a lone soldier whose mission was to take down an entire Soviet missile base using only a penknife. And people complain of military overfunding using taxpayers' money. Now, aside from the famous NES port, The Adventures of Captain Stabby was also released on a number of home computers at the time, courtesy of Ocean Software's subsidiary, Imagine Software. And a pretty decent job they did of it too. Well, aside from the Amstrad version having that irritating flip screen thing going on. But it sold well enough for Ocean to pitch a sequel to Konami in the guise of The Vindicator, Green Beret 2. Now what makes this pitch sequel weird is rather than stick to the tried and tested left to right arcade affair, rupturing as many spleens as possible on your way, Ocean went for the let's make it incredibly stupid instead approach, where instead of fighting the Ruskies, you wander around a giant maze killing the xenomorphs from Alien, so you can steal their security passes to access an elevator. Yes. Which then takes you to a rather decent Jackal knockoff, where you must battle a giant enemy, lobster. For some reason. Which in turn, after completing that, leads you to an actual platform level where you fight decapitated Ninja Turtles and cyborg flea men from Castlevania. And this is then rounded off with the most depressing game completion screen ever. Nice. What's even more curious is there's no evidence whether this pitch sequel was actually rejected or not, as the Green Beret 2 tag was actually added and then removed at whim several times over the various re-releases of the game. Well, aside from your Sinclair magazine, who seemed to think it was funny to call the game Green Bert 2. Hilarious. What the heck is Switchblade, Larry? Well, in all fairness, Switchblade is probably the most obscure game on our list, which is a shame really, as both the original and the sequel are pretty awesome. Then again, what do you expect of the publishers, aside from the home computer ports, only ever released it on unpopular consoles, such as the Amstrad GX4000 and the Atari Lynx? But both Switchblade games are best described as anime-inspired platformers that play like a Metroidvania game, but aren't. It's hard to explain, but if you like games where you explore hidden areas, you'll absolutely love this. They're criminally overlooked classics. However, Switchblade's biggest complaint by both the press and gamers at the time was it always played way too slow for their liking, so for the third game they wanted to speed the game up tenfold. Unfortunately, what they had developed in the end was a game that felt nothing like a title in the Switchblade series. It felt more like a console game. So they ripped out the hero, and replaced him with what people thought was a ninja ant, but is actually a ninja gremlin, then renamed it after the dog in Ghostbusters. Zool. It seems to have done the trick, as Zool was arguably one of the biggest successes of the early 90s tsunami of mascots, with the extraterrestrial assassin appearing on practically every system available at the time. Arguably, Zool is pretty vanilla as platform games go, and is blatantly influenced by Sonic more than anything, though it kinda misses the point of what made Sonic so great. And while he may look like a Ninja Turtle stuck in an inflated gimp suit, he caught Commodore's eye for them to want to make him the official mascot for the Commodore Amiga, even as far as to make the sequel exclusive and bundle it with the launch of the Amiga CD32, which ended up not happening as it got stuck in development hell and was instead replaced by Oscar the platforming otter. Remember him? Exactly. And to make things even worse, this wasn't to be the last of Zool's problems. Yup, your eyes don't deceive you. It is Zool again. For a mascot set up to rival Sonic, they sure made some pretty idiotic decisions, such as making a sequel console exclusive to the Amiga CD32 and later on the Atari Jaguar. So brilliant judgment there, guys. But it did pretty much kill the franchise at the time. The developer Gremlin Graphics were bought out by Infogrames in 1999, and that was pretty much the end of the story. However, fast forward to the mid-noughties, where there was one more attempt to make a third game in the Zool franchise. This time, a full 3D world for the PS2, PC, and Nintendo Wii. Which, obviously, didn't happen, and ended up, well, devolving into Gingerbread Man. Yup, every angry gamer's favourite whipping boy was originally meant to be the third instalment of Zool. It turns out Ian Stewart, the ex-director of Gremlin Graphics' new company Zool Digital, had managed to pick up the Zool licence once again and commissioned a little-known British developer by the name of Data Design Interactive to create an all-new game for them. Unfortunately, Zool wasn't too impressed with what Data Design had come up with. Well, wasn't too impressed meaning outright horrified at how terrible it was, so promptly cancelled the entire project. But seeing as Data Design was so far in development, and noticing people will buy any old crap as long as it's cheap, they decided to stump up the cash themselves to finish the game. Changed Zool into a perturbed male wheat product, and released it as a budget title in 2005 as Gingerbread Man. Then re-released that a few months later as Billy the Wizard. Anubis II, Trixie in Toyland, and Rock'n'Roll Adventures. In fact, Data Design pushed out so much shovelware tripe based on a Gingerbread Man engine, they single-handedly became the biggest third-party developer for the Wii, and the fourth largest publisher in the world. Also, their Wikipedia page reads like a press release, so it's way overdue for some vandalism. But Zool is the main reason why Gingerbread Man is set in a candy world. It's also why there's only 4 levels in the game, as they couldn't be asked to develop anymore. And what better way to round up this list than quite possibly the most famous fighting game in history? Well, except we're not talking about the beloved Street Fighter 2, but the original instead. You know, the one that even Capcom pretends doesn't exist. Now, in all fairness, Street Fighter 1 wasn't exactly the greatest game in the world. Only 2 characters to choose from, irresponsible controls, finicky special moves that only work 50% of the time, voice acting provided by a man who refuses to use vowels.
Muslims, but don't forget there are many gods like you all over the world.
And to top it all off, stick it in an arcade machine that's first iteration used pneumatic pressure buttons that you could literally break your knuckles on if it wasn't properly maintained. This is why Capcom created 6-button fighting games, people. Not out of innovation, but just fear of being sued. Of course, Street Fighter 1 proved popular enough in arcades to be ported to multiple home systems at the time, such as the TurboGrafx, where they swapped the name around to avoid copyright infringement, and the absolutely abysmal tier text conversions to home computers. Ports so incompetently programmed, they was too stupid to even code in special moves. In fact, the Commodore 64 port is so bad that US Gold, the publisher, even stuck the separate North American conversion on the B-side of the cassette as a desperate attempt to appease review scores. Didn't work though. But as bad as the game was, it sold rather well, which we all know means inevitable sequel. But rather than wait for Capcom to eventually make their own sequel, Tiertex impatiently decided to make their own one instead, entitled Human Killing Machine Street Fighter 2, and pitched that to Capcom. Now, Human Killing Machine sees you playing as a South Korean kickboxer Kwon, and you only get to play as Kwon as well, as nobody wants to be confused with variety in a fighting game now, do they? But Kwon travels around the world fighting prostitutes, German shepherds, bulls, and various other racist stereotypes in a bid to be crowned the accolade of Human Killing Machine. Not exactly sure why, as you don't actually kill anyone in the game, just place them in a mild coma at worst. But despite them doing a pretty slapdash port of the original game, Tiertex thought Street Fighter obviously wasn't good enough as it was, so they decided to implement a couple of their own improvements to the genre. And what were those, I hear you ask? Well, they did away with those oh-so-pointless features, such as having a 2-player mode and any scrolling whatsoever, then added an idiotic round winning system where the worse you are at the game, the more unfair it becomes. What's even worse is the ports themselves are downright awful. From the 2-colour headache-inducing Spectrum port, the frustratingly slow, ugly and completely unplayable Amstrad version, to the truly despicable Commodore Amiga release. A game so incompetently put together, they forgot to add the Spanish stage, messed up the colours of hands in the German stage, to the creme de la creme, the final boss Merc ever isn't even in the game. Well, he technically is, he's just mostly invisible, as it's just a completely screwed up sprite of Miguel in its place. And guess what? They never patched it. It wasn't even recalled. This is the final version that was released. So where did this all go wrong? Well, despite these amazing genre-defining innovations, unfortunately, not known to them, Capcom were already in development of a Street Fighter sequel. But this was 1988. The actual Street Fighter 2 we came to know and love wouldn't be released for another 3 years. What Capcom actually had in development was Final Fight, or Street Fighter 89 as it was called at the time. There's even a winky little nod to this in the actual Street Fighter 2, as Cody is the punching bloke in the intro. I bet you didn't notice that before. Astonishingly, in defiance of Capcom telling them where to shove their abomination, it didn't stop Tiertex pitching further sequels to them, which they did successfully 2 years later with Strider 2, or Strider Returns it's more commonly known as now. And surprise surprise, that was a pile of crap too. So it's nice to see Tiertex can remain consistent. So Street Fighter had not one, but 2 pitch sequels that are eventually changed. One an all-time classic, the other one being one of the worst fighters of the 80s. In fact, even back in 1988, magazines were calling Human Killing Machine the worst fighting game they'd ever seen. So, if you ever want to play a great 80s fighter released on home computers, go play IK+, or Chop and Drop as it's called in the US, which comes complete with this awesome box art of someone kicking Angry Joe in the face. Thanks for watching this first episode of Fact Hunt. Hopefully you liked the slight change in direction for my Yank series, but if you've got any opinions or what you'd like to see next, drop me a message in the comments below. And if you liked what you see, please subscribe to be first to see the next episode as soon as it's available. And if you want to be super awesome, check out my Patreon to help me make more episodes. But thanks again for watching, peoples, and I'll see you next time.